Okay, so I'm Tyler Moore. I'm a professor at Bellevue University. What I kind of want to talk about today is the kind of life that you can see around the Omaha Metro, either just in your yard, in some of the parks that we have, maybe your kind of local neighborhood parks, maybe some of the bigger wild areas of the city, and then what you can do to help support that, maintain more habitat spaces. We'll kind of talk about each species specifically, kind of what they need. A lot of the species we're going to talk about today aren't known too much about their life histories. And so I'll kind of speak in some generalities for those. But we'll kind of be talking about how can you keep these interesting things around. And I want to introduce you to some of the cool stuff that's out there. We'll start more common and get more obscure as we go on. And then I'll kind of finish with my recommendation for a super budget makeshift photography setup if you want to just start going around and observing the cool little creatures that you're finding, because it's a whole nother world in there. And if you're in the Earth Day, this honoring diversity is the participation code, so that's what you can use, and I'll try to bring that up as we keep going, just for anyone who might miss it if they join late. So yeah, what we're going to talk about today is what kind of organisms can we observe, and I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list of all these things I've seen. I just want to kind of go through some maybe some common things, and hopefully we can learn a little bit about their life history, some things that you might be familiar with, and maybe some things you didn't know exist, and maybe learning a little bit about how they're living their life, and what just as a piece of evidence for what kind of interesting things are out there. What can you do to make more little interesting things out there? And kind of at the end, how do you kind of photograph, to quote Darwin, the endless forms most beautiful. And I think you can do macro photography on more of a budget than almost any other kind of photography, and then get really interesting photos of things that people have never seen before, without the prohibitive cost that sometimes photography has. So I think photography was kind of my gateway to start thinking about really cool, interesting little things, and I hope it could be for other people as well. And I always like to bring up one of my favorite quotes from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who's the author of Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince. And it's, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. So instead of, badgering everyone to reduce pesticides and plant more native plants and, create habitat gardens in your yards and in your parks, I hope to get people a little bit more excited about the kind of life that is out there, and you can go for a journey. And then once you realize these cool little creatures that are living all around, if you give them space to live and if you give them the right conditions to live, I hope that helps you want to create more space, more conditions that are going to support these creatures. Because growing up experiencing wildlife is really one of the most powerful ways to inspire the curiosity towards science. Scientists, like if you think of all of these famous scientists throughout history, these really successful people who solved major problems, they didn't become scientists because they were sitting in a classroom and someone was badgering facts at them and they were really good at some kind of computing or memorizing facts. For the most part, these people became successful scientists because they were really curious about the natural world, and whether that was observing the stars or observing little life forms or interesting rocks. These experiences are what shape scientists, and really people who think scientifically and curiously, which I think are incredible characteristics. So you don't want only people who have the opportunity to travel out to a national park to be able to experience wildlife and little cool creatures. We want everyone, no matter where they live, deep in the heart of the city, in the suburbs, we want them to be able to experience interesting life all the time. So we're going to start from the more familiar species you probably know, and we'll just kind of go through my observations with them and then go to the more obscure. I will say that almost all of the photos that we're going to go through today were taken in my yard. So just a typical suburban yard, which means that really everything you see here, plus much, much more, can be seen in a small space if you just give it the space to live. So I'm going to start off with a very common and familiar species that we've probably all seen and maybe taken for granted, and that's the fox squirrel, which is probably our most common squirrel. Well, it certainly is our most common squirrel in eastern Nebraska. I think this is like the little primates of Nebraska. We don't have primates here, but we have the next best thing. We've got these highly intelligent, highly agile, arboreal creatures that we can spend time watching. And it's unfortunate that we think of them almost as pests sometimes, but really they're these wonderful creatures that are doing all sorts of things. You probably know that they like to eat large tree seeds, so acorns, hickory, walnuts, but they also are rather omnivorous. So they'll eat insect galls, which are like little protected pieces on the plant for where insects are living inside. They'll eat moths and beetles, anything that they're finding in the trees. They'll eat bird eggs. They're rather resourceful, and if you've ever seen squirrels trying to get into a bird feeder, you can see how intelligent they are. They don't like big gaps in between trees. But thankfully, in the suburbs, we have created these wonderful little highway systems for squirrels, and that's what fence rows are. So they don't have to get on the ground where danger lies. You know, they can go from tree to fence post all the way over to tree. And it's really on the ground when they're out in the open that they're most vulnerable. And so they would really prefer to be there. So how can you support this species? You know, trees that are producing large seeds like an acorn, a hickory, and a walnut. I think native ones are going to be better because they're going to support some of the other things that we're talking about later on. But really, this is a generalist species, so that's why they're so abundant. And, you know, as long as you don't poison them or something, then they should be around. So another species you're probably very familiar with is the American robin. And I just want to point out a couple things that I want to point out in terms of this species in regards to kind of their ecology, life history, and then how you can support them. So robins, you probably see them foraging in lawns, right? They didn't evolve for a lawn. Oops. Maybe I should share my screen, which I'm not doing. What an amateur move. And do you think I was just rambling up here and rambling? Yeah. So fox squirrels. Yeah, so here we went. This is the participation code honoring diversity. So in case you didn't see that before, I had it here at the beginning. Okay. So the robin, you know, of course, they didn't evolve for lawns. What they really probably evolved for is a scattered meadow. So you have like a wooded structure with like opening in that woods that kind of has like a little bit of a short grass wildflowery area. And they forage in those areas. And that's probably where you see them most. Foraging kind of in that short grass, like a lawn, or in leaf litter. And they nest up in the trees in a tree or a shrub, or, you know, even an overhang or something. You maybe have seen them nesting on a building. So they don't need a cavity to nest in like, those little bird houses that you'd sometimes see for other birds. And a lot of times they will overwinter. You'll see them all winter here in Nebraska. Some areas further north, they'll migrate south for the winter, and some do, but others will stay. So they're really eating berries is the primary food in late summer, fall, and winter, but it's really insects and grubs and earthworms in the summer and spring. This species is really susceptible to lawn pesticides because they're doing a lot of their foraging in the lawn. So if you put in pesticides to kill grubs or something in your lawn, this has been shown to be very toxic to robins. And really, the robins are eating those grubs out of your lawn anyway. Things like Japanese beetles, which are growing in your lawn, they are eaten by things pecking around in the lawn, like robins. Another thing you can do is to leave the fallen leaves on your property, because so if you see like this robin here on the left, it is, is scuffling around in the leaves for little insects, spiders, or pupa of caterpillars or something that have overwintered, and it's scuffling around through there and picking them out to eat. This is in our backyard. This is actually our neighbor's elderberry bush, so this is cheating a little bit, but this is a young robin. You can see the spots on it, and it is just gorging itself on the midsummer elderberries. And this lovely elderberry bush of our neighbors, which was a volunteer, just came up along the fence row, has donated so many lovely plants to us as well. And some of them we've kept, and most of them we've either given away or culled, but this is a very prolific plant. The native berries, even though these robins will eat berries and fruits from a lot of different species, the most nutritious fruit that they co-evolved with eating are these native berries. So you'll see them eating the drupes out of a Bradford pear, for example, but those aren't nearly as nutritious as things like elderberries or like the dogwood berries. So and then having nice thick shrubs and trees and evergreens for cover and nesting. You probably see downy woodpeckers. They're here all winter. They really want a deciduous forest, so where the leaves fall, and they are pretty non-specific. They can live, pretty much anywhere in these deciduous woods, and they've a pretty long range. And they are primarily eating insects. And I have seen studies where the woodpeckers, such as the downy, can reduce emerald ash borer by about 85% in an ash tree. So in digging out insects that are inside of the wood, these are actually helping the tree. And they're also in dead branches. They're excavation because they're creating little holes for nesting in. These are also holes that are used by other birds like chickadees. So you can really help species like this by not treating trees with insecticides, because you're starving the birds when you do that. So if you spray the tree with some kind of insect killer, something to kill ants or something to kill beetles or something, every tree you do that on is a tree that won't feed birds like this woodpecker. And then trees that support more insects, which are the native trees in this area. And so some of the trees that support the most insects in our area are like cherries, or oak or willow trees. And so it depends on your habitat in your area, whether it's a big park or your yard, which ones might work best for this. But the ones that are supporting the most insects are going to support the most species like this. Now, the goldfinch, the American goldfinch, is a little bit different from a lot of our other birds that have a diet rich in insects, because the American goldfinch, like a lot of finches, have a really seed-rich diet. So here, even though they're eating some insects, the vast majority of their diet is seeds. And traditionally they like to occupy these woodland edges, so where the wood is kind of open into a prairie or something. And they like an early successional area where what that means is it was recently disturbed and it's colonized with what we would maybe consider weedy plants. So things that come up really fast. And they like those because that means they go to seed early in the summer. And so if they're eating seed all year round, they like things that are going to seed early. And like all birds, this is our little pond that we have. Water features are really important because they need water to drink and then also to rinse the parasites off of them. And then this is some goldfinches kind of foraging on Rudbeckia. So native thistles, sunflowers, asters, anything that has a lot of little seeds, those are great for goldfinches. And if you leave them up all winter, then you have those seeds that are just naturally being made as a food source for the finches, and then they'll last even into the spring. And then you don't have to put up a bird feeder that is, going to drop a bunch of, annoying seeds of some kind, Let me double check that nobody else is. Okay. Yeah. This is probably the most common hawk in the Omaha metro area, the red-tailed hawk. So they'll last really late into the fall and come back fairly early in the spring, but they'll migrate south in the harshest winters. So just to try to get around that, unlike some other hawks, the red-tailed hawk is primarily eating mammals. So this kind of species that's primarily eating mammals can really be negatively impacted by things like poisoning mice. So if you poison mice or some kind of thing and those mice get out and get eaten, this can be highly toxic to these red-tailed hawks that are eating mice. This is another reason why we like squirrels, because squirrels are a great food source for red-tailed hawks. And if you've ever had the opportunity to see a red-tailed hawk nab a squirrel, it's really quite the powerful moment. Song sparrows are one of several of the sparrow species that we see kind of rummaging through our yard. White-throated sparrows, and we see some field sparrows, and if you learn to appreciate the different species of sparrows, you won't just think of them as a sparrow. You'll think of this wonderful bird that is unique in its own way. It has its own evolutionary history and its own diet and its own lifestyle. In the summer, these eat mostly insects. And sparrows are usually pretty good at eating hard-bodied insects like beetles and grasshoppers, but they're feeding their babies soft-bodied insects like caterpillars. And then in winter, they probably have a diet that's rich in seeds. They like to nest kind of low to the ground in thick grasses or maybe even a low shrub. And then those insects are the primary diet of the nestlings. So you can support these things really even right in your backyard or in your own parks by having native herbaceous plants. So like this is a bunch of goldenrod that they're on right now. Or shrubs that have a lot of insects in them. So that way in the summer, they've got a lot of insects to eat. And then coming into, the early spring and, late fall and a little bit of the winter, if they're around, they've got leftover insects for either like egg cases that they can eat insects all winter, or even the seeds of these plants that you leave them up. So if you leave those plants up, then they've got the seeds to eat all winter, and they can be foraging for the insects that are overwintering in these plants. We're right now in the time of year for warblers to be migrating through. This is from this spring, actually, this photo. The yellow-rumped warbler is one of the most common that you can see around the Omaha area, and they don't go as far south as some of the warblers. Some of the warblers go all the way down into South America during our winter. But the yellow-rumped warbler has the ability to eat wax-covered berries that last well into the winter, and so they can eat those wax-covered berries, and so they might migrate only as far south as maybe Oklahoma or Texas. So it depends, and some of them might even overwinter here. They like woodlands or shrublands during their migration through, which is the fall and the spring, which is going on right now. And you can see these, if you have native trees that you don't treat with insecticide, you'll see these birds flopping around from branch to branch and eating insects out of the tree, which is exactly what this bird here was doing. It's bouncing from limb to limb, flapping its wings, just like you might see like some of the kinglets, the other warblers are doing right now. They are kind of rustling some insects up so they can eat them. So that's what, especially in the spring, their main diet is insects. So again, you're hearing this reoccurring theme. If you need insects, you need insects in order to have these birds, because they're migrating well into Canada to do their breeding, and they need a lot of protein-rich food to fuel that. This is a pied-billed grebe, and this is from actually not in our yard. This is out at Chalco, if I remember correctly. And these come from the tropics during our winter, and then up through kind of following the water as it thaws. So as the water thaws, these will be up there. And so they like to eat any kind of little animal life that are among the vegetation in the water, and they nest adjacent to the water. So they'll be nesting here. And if you have lakes or ponds with abundant stream life, healthy streamside vegetation, so plenty of grasses and stuff that's going up against the banks, you can support the nests. And then you can support in your very own yard, even if you don't have a pond or something that large enough to support grebes, just by limiting your fertilizer use, because fertilizers are running off into all of our local waterways, and they're creating eutrophication, which is big algae blooms. And this is limiting the value of these ponds and lakes for diverse wildlife. And then a couple of the other warblers, this is a couple that we've seen in our yard. This is American redstart. It's sometimes called like, you know, the bumblebee or butterfly of birds. They're kind of skipping and bouncing around, fluttering about. And they come from way down in the tropics up, and they're on our way right now up through Canada. And in the next couple weeks here is really when they're going to kind of be hitting their peak. And they spend almost their entire life eating insects. So they are following the insects, basically. So they're not coming up until new leaves are coming out. So new insects are eating those leaves, and so they can be eating the new insects. Big way to support this is native trees that support a lot of insects. This isn't the case here, but we usually see them hopping around in our oak trees. They like dense canopy cover because they're spending a lot of time in forests. And again, insecticides are starving these birds, so you want to try to limit those as much as possible. And another thing you can do from your home that's not involving something that you do necessarily in your backyard, but something you do in your house, is buy shade-grown coffee that is certified bird-friendly by the Smithsonian. The shade-grown coffee is, instead of clearing out the tropical forests and putting in coffee trees, they are planting shade-grown coffee underneath the canopy trees. And what this does is it allows you to maintain a rainforest where these birds are spending the winter down there while still growing coffee, which we all love. And if it's certified bird-friendly shade coffee, that means that the canopy is still native plants. If it's not certified bird-friendly, you can grow shade-grown coffee. You can buy shade-grown coffee where they do the shade coffee underneath, but then they plant an agricultural plant up top, you know, like some fruit tree. that at least is a double use of the agriculture, but it's still clearing away habitat for these birds that they need to be eating insects all winter while they're down there to fuel up for the migration back north. So that certified bird friendly, where there's native tropical rainforest cover with shade grown coffee underneath, that can make a huge difference because you're incentivizing that, maintaining that land in natural habitat. And of course, that's a carbon sink as well. And really, I get that coffee, and it's just as good as any. There's a bunch of different blends. There's a bunch of different roasts. It's really quite good. It's a little bit more expensive, but the karma is great, and you feel good drinking it. And the same kind of goes for, this is Magnolia Warbler, and this was kind of bouncing around between a spruce tree in our yard and the oak tree, the pin oak. And it again, it's mostly exclusively caterpillars, and along with the other warblers, these are a diet very rich in insects throughout the course of their life. So all the same things that you're supporting for the other warblers. And so this is the time of year to, if you've got a bunch of tree cover in your property and you are not treating with insecticides, get out there in the early mornings and then kind of until the sun starts cresting, and watch what kind of birds you have coming through, whether it's in your yard, in a local park. I'm hoping that within walking distance, you will be able to see these fun warblers anywhere where you are. That's really a goal of mine. So I'm going to start moving into invertebrates because I think those might be a little underappreciated, and we'll start going from some that might be more common to some that are perhaps less known, and some that I really don't even know very much about. So the painted lady is one of the most common butterflies really in the world. They migrate across continents, and they're very common because they're generalists. The caterpillars eat a wide variety of plants, thistles and asters and hollyhocks and all sorts of things. And so because of that, the caterpillars can grow all over the place and eat a lot of different foods. The adults nectar on flowers, and they prefer composite flowers. So in the Asteraceae family, so this could be the native asters, Liatris, ironweed, joe pye weed, buttonbush, milkweed, native thistles. And the good thing about all those plants is they're going to be supporting a bunch of other species as well. And you can get these species in your area by planting flowers that bloom during the migration, which is late summer, and then not treating with pesticide. If you just do that, and really basically any flower without pesticide, you're going to get painted ladies. They're not very specific, and they're migrating through, so you don't even have to grow the caterpillar in your yard. And that's pretty easy. I recommend using native flowers and have native flowers that are blooming throughout the season. That way, you're not just supporting painted ladies, you're doing the others as well as we're going forward. Another that is probably the symbol of invertebrates and of invertebrate habitat is the monarch. And here is one where the caterpillar is a specialist, and that's the case very frequently, even though I'm not necessarily going to be talking a whole lot about caterpillar specialists here. Many caterpillars are specialists. In this case, these caterpillars only eat milkweed. So these are in the genus Asclepius. But the adults are going to nectar on a wide range of flowers, even though they do have some preferences. So I have found Liatris, which is what's pictured in this. Asclepius, which this is down here in this lower picture, is swamp milkweed. Asclepius incarnata, Solidago, which are the goldenrods, and Symphyotrichum, which are the native asters. I found those to be a preference. They're blooming during the times when monarchs are coming, either on their first migration or their latter migration back down to Mexico, because these take multiple generations to come from Mexico up through to just kind of the southern parts of Canada and then all the way back down. And so in order for monarchs to be successful, they have to plant eggs and grow caterpillars up each step of the way, each of these generations through. And so they need milkweed all the way along this path because it takes multiple generations to make it all the way up. Thankfully, these are great plants and they're fairly easy to grow, and so you can do these right in your yard, right in your parks. The more you have, the more monarchs. And the eastern monarchs are facing a huge decline, and the western monarchs are almost gone. So really, the eastern monarchs are really the only chance of maintaining monarch butterflies as a species. And this is one of the most dramatic butterflies on the planet. So we would hate to be responsible for their loss. In addition to milkweed, you also need good nectar plants because those adults need to fuel up in order to make those long migrations. Liatris is a good one. Goldenrods, native asters, and again, those are going to be supporting other things as well. And then instead of having one plant with that flower, if good clusters of those plants, they're more visible and they also look nicer. This is our Liatris in our backyard. It's kind of a nice cluster of these. And you can see there's a bumblebee down on this one too. It's almost impossible to get a photo of an insect without another insect in it. And again, you'll hear me saying this over and over again, no pesticides. And a big one for these migratory insects are mosquito fogging, which has been shown to not be very effective against mosquitoes because mosquitoes have a really short life cycle. So you can't fog for mosquitoes quick enough to reduce mosquitoes. But it works really well at killing butterflies. So when you're indiscriminately fogging insecticides through the air, this is a big loss to butterflies. So if you can find out if your area or your community is doing this, and if they are, try to push for them to stop mosquito fogging. I can help you find some of the evidence that's showing that it's not effective against mosquitoes, and it instead is killing beneficial insects. This is another butterfly that you might see fairly commonly. This is an orange sulfur, and they're fairly common because the caterpillars eat legumes. So this is a wide range of things. The native ones are like the Baptisia and Senna and there's partridge pea and Lespedeza, but there's also, they'll eat the European clovers as well, and cultivated clovers like beans and peas. So they can sometimes be a little bit of a agricultural pest, and the adults nectar on flowers. But it's just a lovely butterfly, so how could you possibly consider it to be a pest? And you can support them by, the simplest thing is just letting some clover go where you're not always mowing it to kill caterpillars. Or if you want to be a little bit, support some other species as well, some native legumes that would support sulfurs as well as other things that are more specialized, and some summer blooming flowers. This is a gray hair streak. It's another generalist caterpillar, and the caterpillars will eat just about anything, but they seem to have a preference for legumes as well. And the adults will nectar on some flowers. This is one of the most productive flowers in our yard in terms of insect activity, and that's rattlesnake master, and it's just a lovely flower. And basically all you need to do to get these really cool butterflies is just no insecticides and have some flowers for the adults. This is a cool little group of butterflies called the skippers, and this is peck skipper in particular. But these are butterflies that are almost a mix between a butterfly and a moth. They kind of have this triangular shape here, and they're kind of fuzzy like a moth. And almost all of the skippers use grasses as their host plant, which means the caterpillars are eating grasses or sedges. Peck skipper is no exception to that. And in fact, they'll even use Kentucky bluegrass and fescues that are in your lawn as a host plant. And the adults, they like to nectar. This is on a native aster, but they'll also on milkweeds, native thistles, or even blooming clover that is kind of scattered about in the lawn. So you could support species like this just by having sections of your lawn that you don't mow very frequently, and you kind of allow things like clover to come up in that lawn area. So if it's an area that you're walking on still frequently, lawn is a good choice because lawn can handle walking. Just you could reduce that mowing frequency, or maybe switch to a no-mow or an eco-grass, some of these really slow-growing grasses that you don't have to mow very often, and you couldn't even just let them flop over, and they don't go to seed, and they look still pretty nice. Prairie Moon has these, and Prairie Nursery. And with that and a little bit of clover, you'll get skippers coming up in your yard, and they'll be just fine. If you want to go a step further, you could plant native grasses, like our little blue stem, side oats, switchgrass. All of these are good host plants for caterpillars. And then some diverse native flowers for the adults to give them some good nectar. So then kind of moving into some other insects, this is one that's probably really familiar to you. It's native to Eurasia, maybe to the continent of Africa, if you go back far enough, but it's now been introduced, and it's everywhere in North America. They're a generalist pollinator, so they can pollinate a bunch of different plants, and that's why they're used agriculturally. And they make social hives that can last for multiple years, unlike most bees that usually live, have one round of a nest. It lasts a year. And I meant to, this is cut off, they can fly, which I think is really funny that cut off. I meant to put that they can fly long distances, so they're not restricted to, areas right around the nesting site, which makes them, in some terms efficient pollinators, because you could plop them, in an agricultural site, and they can go pollinate all of these crops as they're flying around. These could be considered an invasive species in the United States because the wild populations of honeybee are impeding the success of native bees, which is reducing the diversity of native bees, which are really important for pollinating a lot of our native flowers and keeping our native ecosystems intact. So they probably really don't need your support. But if you are supporting a honeybee in just a general sense, without like literally growing them yourself, you're probably supporting all of these other native pollinators as well. So reducing insecticides and fungicides, full season blooms, starting with blooms that come out very early, because honeybees can come out quite early in the year. That brings us to the bumblebees, like this. So these are in the genus Bombus. So that's what my daughter always calls them, Bombus, which I think is just a fun word. These are really efficient pollinators because they can buzz pollinate, which they can actually vibrate their body, and that's what gives them that bumblebee name. You've probably heard this, bumbling. And they are not as fully social as like a honeybee, but they do kind of have a queen that'll come out early. They'll overwinter in the soil, and then they'll kind of emerge as the temperatures start getting warm. You might see them flying around now, these really big bumblebees. Those are the queens. And they'll go collect pollen from early blooming plants, and they'll start building a nest with that pollen. And that way they can start making this nest with larvae in there. And then the queen stays in there, and the workers go provision pollen from the plants throughout the rest of the year. So in order to support bumblebees, it's important to have really early blooming flowers, because those queens need flowers as soon as the temperatures start to warm up. So this could be as early as late February and into March, because on a warm day, depending on where they nest, their nest could get warmed up by the sun, and they can pop out, and they can need some forage. A lot of this time, these are trees that are good for that, or shrubs, so like willows and maples, but also early ephemerals, pasca flower, like spring beauty, things that would be blooming in the woodlands, like trout lily. And then for the later, like the workers that are going to come out and help feed the nest, you need full season of blooms because these are going to be active all year to help feed those larvae. So native flowers are probably best, especially for some of the less common bumblebees, even though bumblebees are generally more of a generalist pollen collector. Definitely no insecticides and fungicides. But then here it's probably important to leave plant material and leaves behind to make sure that the queens survive overwintering. You know, it's nice and warm under the soil with a nice blanket of leaves. This is I think it's a common bumblebee that is on. This is Rudbeckia lanceolata, sometimes wild golden glow. It's a really cool beneficial plant that's in our backyard. And then this is the group of the Longhorn Bees, and these are just some of the wonderful native bee diversity that you can see in the state. So these are a couple Longhorn Bees. The males have the longer of the Longhorns than the females. These are two different species though, and I like this one on the right because they kind of have these little Ugg boots, these little furry legs here. These are very efficient pollinators, and this group of the Longhorn Bees includes some specialists. Some of the more famous ones are like the squash bees that are pollinating cucumbers and squash. They're some of the best pollinators of cucumbers and squash, and they specialize, though they only gather pollen from those species. You can support these by planting diverse native flowers because you might be able to support some specialist native bees if you have distinct species of native flowers, because you might just be able to keep alive a bee that specializes on that particular lineage of plant, because many of them do. So the more of those native flowers that you have, the more likely you're going to be able to keep more of these different species of these bees. The other thing is these bees will often nest in the stems of plants. So if you leave those stems up over winter, it's going to preserve them until the next year. And then when you cut them, it kind of at the beginning of the year, leave enough of the stem up that they can kind of create cavities in there to nest later on. And wasps always get a bad rap, but they're really quite wonderful and they're lovely. And these solitary wasps, like the ones I'm going to show you, you can see how close I am to these wasps, and they're not going to harm you. I mean, they're so peaceful, and these stingers that they have are made for stinging their prey to paralyze them. So they're not meant for stinging humans. In fact, some of these, if they sting you, you might not even feel it because it's just not very good of a stinger for piercing mammal tissue. This one in particular, what they do is they paralyze caterpillars and grasshoppers and crickets, and then they drag them back to their nest to feed to their young, which I think is just beautiful. And then the adults eat nectar. This one is nectaring on some pycnanthemum, which is mountain mint, which is a really great plant for moths. And moths are really valuable because they are then controlling caterpillar populations, and crickets and grasshoppers. And those crickets and grasshoppers and caterpillars are things that are going to eat plants. So if you don't have those controls, then you could have destruction of plants by too much herbivory. So here's another one. This is the Fraternal Wasp, Eumenes fraternus, and they're a potter wasp, which means they make a little nest out of mud, and they will then paralyze caterpillars, and they prefer these certain groups of moth caterpillars, and they'll take those back to the nest, and while that caterpillar is still alive, they'll lay some eggs up in there, and then the larva will hatch and eat that caterpillar. And then the adults feed on nectar. So in order to have these things around, you want to have diverse native plants, because those diverse native plants are going to grow diverse species of caterpillars. So that's what those wasps are going to use to attack. And these wasps can be very specialized on certain groups of caterpillars or sometimes spiders, where they will only use those as a prey animal. And then you want flowers for the adults, because the adults get their energy through nectaring on flowers. And some really good plants for wasps are mountain mint, like Pycnanthemum, or rattlesnake master, Eryngium yuccifolium. These are great wasp plants. And some people, when they're first kind of learning about diversity of organisms, they're thinking, well, I want to attract butterflies, but not bees and wasps. And then when they go a step further, it was like, well, I want butterflies and bees, but not wasps. But once you start realizing that these are not going to hurt you, just like bees, most bees are solitary, they're very peaceful. Most wasps are solitary and very peaceful, and they're not going to hurt you. And in fact, good wasp plants are maintaining the whole ecosystem health of your area, whether it's your park, your yard. And so these plants, and yeah, I mean, they sound and look terrifying, as you're saying, and it's terrifying, but in kind of a cool way, right? Just like as like watching a scary movie is kind of beautiful in its obscureness. There's something quite lovely about that. So these wasps have these real thin waists to make them flexible, so they can bend over, bend around and just bam, 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 bam with that stinger in order to paralyze caterpillars and sometimes spiders, depending on what they do. Flies are sometimes overlooked by people because their flies are kind of often thought of as dirty because, some species of flies eat, manure and stuff like that. But this whole group of hoverflies are highly beneficial insects. The adults eat pollen and nectar from flowers. Here's a couple different species that we see in our yard. This on the left, this one is on Tradescantia, which is Spiderwort, and on the right, I feel like this is it's something in Asteraceae. I think it's a sunflower because look at these individual tubes. Maybe woodland sunflower. But what's interesting about these is the larvae are predators, and these larvae they'll lay their eggs on plants, and these larvae will come around and eat aphids, and then they'll pupate and then become these adults. And so having these things around is really healthy for your garden. So if you have a vegetable garden, keeping these flowers around that will attract hoverflies like these syrphid flies is a great way to prevent aphids from being a problem in your garden. I'm going to talk about some of the other little tiny and maybe kind of somewhat unknown bees that we see. This is a Seratina, a little Carpenter Bee, and they form nests in stems of plants, and that's where they overwinter, and they'll do this too throughout the season. And they kind of dig out in a little stem of a plant, and they can really dig these little tiny holes, and they kind of go in there. This is a very small bee, and this is here. It's on, I think, I don't know, maybe Heath aster, maybe, or calico aster, one of the native kind of a shadier aster. And these bees can be really beautiful in blues and greens and their tones, and you just have to look closely to see it. And you can really help these bees by planting hollow stem plants that have a good nesting site, like jobai weed and monarda, but then also leaving those plants over winter so that those bees have a place to nest. This is a leafcutter bee, and they're called leafcutter bees because they make little nests in pre-existing holes by what I think of as like a little sleeping bag of a leaf. So if you ever see these really round cuts in some of your leaves, those are from leafcutter bees. They cut these round notches and they roll them up, and then they take them and make their little nests out of there for their larvae, and then they go get pollen to feed the larvae. They really like Asclepias, so milkweed. So not only if you're planting milkweed for monarchs, you also see these really cool leafcutter bees there as well. And then this is an unidentified sweat bee, so in the family Halictidae, which is a very large family of these are little tiny bees. This one is very little tiny. Most of these are ground nesting bees, so they almost look like ants until you see them kind of flying away. Some of them are very specialized on particular flowers. This one's not, because it is on a dandelion. So this one is from this year, and it was very early in the year when there was only dandelions blooming, And this lovely little bee, you can see it has all these little tiny dots of pollen all over him. And this is great because he's going to pollinate things, but this is what he's collecting to bring back to its nest. And so provisioning for larvae. And you can help these by having things that bloom really early and then all through the season, because they can come out all through the season. This is Hylaeus, which is, I think, is just a lovely little bee. This is on a rattlesnake master. You can see how tiny this little bee is, just from, we've seen this flower before. And they don't excavate their own cavities. Instead, they nest in cavities that are already made in plants or wood. And they don't carry the pollen on the outside of their body. You see there's no pollen on this fly. They instead almost eat it. They put it in a little crop and then they regurgitate it to their larvae. And because they have a short tongue, they can only really access these pollen or these nectar sources on plants that are kind of the same kind of plants that would support wasps. So think of like this is rattlesnake master, Eryngium yucifolium, or maybe Zizia aurea, which is golden Alexander, or Pycnanthemum, the mountain mint. You may or may not have seen crab spiders, which are these lovely little spiders that sit and wait on flowers for things to, like maybe for pollinators to come, and they then use their large legs along with their jaws to capture things and then bite them and then paralyze them. And I've seen these take down bees, which is pretty remarkable. And they can change their color in order to be camouflaged with different environments. Here, if you get flowers blooming throughout the year, like echinaceas are good, Rudbeckia, members of the Asteraceae family, they will inevitably eventually get these crab spiders on there because they're going after the things that are visiting those flowers. This is a cucumber spider, and this is one that has a nice little meal here, and they're an orb weaver, and this one may have been introduced from Europe. I think from what I've read, it's a little unclear. It might be native here as well, but it's much more rare here than in Eurasia. So the thought is that it's been recently introduced here, but we're not really sure. And like most spiders, as long as you have enough food, you can keep these spiders around. And again, spiders, these are things that are reducing number of flies and mosquitoes and stuff because they're getting caught and getting eaten. And also spiders are a fantastic food source for birds. So even if you may have a kind of a aversion to spiders, you should at least know that they are really valuable in the ecosystem. If you don't have an aversion, you can just recognize how wonderful they look up close and how interesting they look. This is a Tachnid fly, and the group of Tachnid flies are really interesting because they aren't host specific, but they lay their eggs on their host, and then their larvae will consume that host and kill it. And they can do this to caterpillars, to sawfly larvae, to beetles, all sorts of things. And so they're really important for controlling pests. This thing, as you look on it, if you weren't familiar with it, you might think of it as a pest yourself, but it's not. It's actually, the adults probably mostly feed on nectar and maybe some sweet stuff and like a rotting fruit or something from time to time. But their larvae are controlling populations of other potential pest insects. Because they're non-specific, they can probably kill even invasive species of insects, possibly like even things like Japanese beetles. Yeah, so I see the question about a lot of no insecticides. So I will say we do get Japanese beetles at our house, and people always ask me about this. They come up for maybe a couple weeks, and they have not killed a single plant at our house. So I would say the best thing to do for Japanese beetles is to have a lot of insect diversity, because there are going to be non-specific predators of Japanese beetles. So things like Tachnid flies, things like wasps, that are not very host specific, but they will use beetles as prey, or at least beetle larvae. Some wasps will crawl into the soil and sting and paralyze beetle larvae nondescriptly and use those as hosts. I don't know if it's that or what it is, but or there's a couple species I'm going to talk about in a second that are some pretty voracious predators. I think what happens is they can't get to very high numbers in our yard because we have so many predaceous insects in there. And that even though they're an invasive and they don't have any specialized insect here that targets them, the generalist insects do. And so I would say until you get enough plant diversity in the area of interest, whether it's your yard or park, try to go around and flick them into some soap. So just flick them into a little jar of soap, and you do that, for a week or two, every once in a while, whenever you have time. And once you do that, and over the years, if you kind of build up your plant diversity and you don't use insecticides, it'll get to a point where, yeah, you'll see some Japanese beetles and they'll chew on some plants, but they're not going to kill plants because there's just too much other stuff there to control them. And you got to be okay with a little bit of damage to plants, because what that damage is just stuff eating the plants, and that's what an ecosystem is supposed to do. That's what plants are for. They get eaten, and then the energy moves up to higher trophic levels. This is what I think is a really cool little fly. It's a rust fly, and some of the rust flies are crop pests, because what they can do is they can stab this little ovipositor that they have at the posterior here into the stem and inject their eggs in there, and then the larva will eat the plant tissues from the inside. This one in particular isn't a pest, and I can't really find very much information about it. Some evidence suggests that they might lay their eggs inside stems of carex species, which are the sedges. So maybe some native sedges are the host plant for these. We certainly have plenty of those at our house. But it took me a little while to even identify what this thing was. But this is some of the things that you can find that you never even knew existed by just kind of wandering around. This is a beetle that you may have seen before. It's the Goldenrod soldier beetle. And they can be a little assuming at the end of summer if you have something like goldenrod, because they can come in large numbers around the time when goldenrod is blooming and they're gathering pollen. They like a goldenrod, but they're not complete specialists on goldenrod. They'll do other plants that are blooming at the same time. But the really cool thing about these is, again, their larvae are predators. So they are controlling populations of grasshoppers, caterpillars, which become moths and stuff like that, that anything that's soft-bodied, these are eating. And so this is, again, keeping the ecosystem in balance by having multiple connections between things, so not any one thing can dominate. They overwinter as pupa, so again, this is leaving the leaves and the plants up on your property so that you're not removing these. This is another strange little fly that we've seen. It's called a picture wing fly, Delphinia. I'm not exactly sure the exact species. We don't really know very much about the life history of this fly altogether, but we do know that they feed on decaying vegetation or maybe rotting fruit or something, so they probably aid in decomposition. And so allowing some of that plant material to just kind of lay on your site. You don't have to keep everything so tidy. So kind of use some of your old plant material as mulch around some of your habitat garden sites. This is one that I think is kind of cool. They're a little hard to get a photo of because they're so hoppy, but this is the candy striped leafhopper, and they are a generalist that feeds on the plant sap like most of these true leaf bugs. And so just having plants around as food and enough cover where they can, have some habitat. This is another species of beetle that we saw, and in fact, this is the first recorded observation of this beetle in Sarpy County, which I thought was kind of neat. So they're extending their range up. This is striped longhorn bee, Hippopsis lemniscata. We don't really know what it eats, but probably something in our yard. It might be a generalist. I'm not really sure. This is one of the bugs that can eat Japanese beetles. The wheel bug, it uses this big sharp kind of proboscis on the front to pierce the shell, and it'll suck their juices out. So these require what I would call like a stable ecosystem. So because they need a lot of prey to eat. And so if you get to the point where you have these in your yard, so this is in our backyard, then you can start feeling a little bit better about not having to use any kind of pesticides or not really worrying about pests, because nothing can really get too out of control when you've got these wheel bugs around. And another one are these really cool assassin bugs, which are also these little ambush bugs, sorry, unlike the assassin wheel bugs, which kind of jump out and kind of grab things the way a crab spider does. We've got Katydids, which this is an early nymphal stage of this bush katydid. We really don't know if they have host specificity, but we've seen them. So again, it's one that they eat. They must eat something that we have. So one of the many things that you can find if you've got a bunch of herbaceous perennial plants. Here it is on some spiderwort. This is Tradescantia ohioensis. And then many, many more things. And of course, we don't have time to cover all of the possible things that there are. But I just want to real quick, if you were interested in observing what I would call the endless forms most beautiful, quoting Darwin, I think step one is kind of keep promoting habitat, whether it's in your yard, your parks, or your nature areas, and keep improving the quality of that habitat. A tiny spot with native plants can make a huge difference, and in even like a larger spot with more species can be an incredible biological oasis. You could spend all of your time looking in there for new interesting species. Step two, get a simple macro photography setup, and I would start with, this would be my recommendation. Get a quote-unquote outdated DSLR. This 20D, I used to shoot weddings with these back when I was working in high school. We had opened a little wedding photography business, and this was a multi-$1,000 camera when it came out, and it has not gotten any worse than it got then. There are just new cameras out now. This camera is just as good as it was when people are paying thousands of dollars for it. You can now go and get it for $40 off eBay. $40. Okay, so you get your $40 camera, you get a 4 gigabyte CF card for $8, and then you can get a Canon 50mm 1.8 for $120, brand new. Then you get extension tubes. $129 for these Kenko extension tubes, and that's a total cost of only $296. If you want to spend a little bit more money and be a little bit better off, skip the 51.8 and get this $350 macro lens along with those extension tubes. This will be a total of $528, and you are going to have all of the opportunity in the world to take macro photos. And is the tiniest little things, you can blow them up to huge magnification and really high quality. And really, $500 is not that much money. Spend your money, if you're going to spend a little bit more money on this lens and those extension tubes, get $40 DSLR is fantastic. If you want to spend more money on a nicer DSLR, fine, but you don't have to. Don't let it be cost prohibitive. So really, for $296, you can get a really good setup for going out and exploring cool little creatures. What do you do next? Try to get as fast of a shutter as you can and as small as aperture as possible, because when you use those extension tubes and you're focusing really up close, your range of focus is going to be really narrow. So stop down to 5.6 or maybe to f8, or if you can to f11, maybe even more if you have enough light. And then go up to a higher ISO, because it's really pretty easy to reduce noise in post-production. And so don't worry too much about noise. And frankly, most of the photos that you take, or you're going to be, you know, using them on the internet or something. And so they're going to be so small that most people won't be able to see noise. And then what you do is you move really slowly. Be really careful with your focusing. Hold your breath, because any tiny little movement is going to draw things out of focus. And then hopefully you're going to get lucky. So I know we went a little bit over time here because, you know, I always have a lot to say. But does anyone have any questions? I'm happy to stop recording if we want to take any questions. I'll stop recording just in case anyone has any questions. Okay.